Good afternoon and welcome back to our interview series. We're here with Gregg Perry at the Shivers Conservation Studio, and we're talking with Gregg today about his start with the furniture making business. So, Gregg, let's continue. And can you discuss how long did it take for your furniture business to become lucrative or self-supporting?
Virtually, when we were talking about our last presentation, that when I had a truck and I put facades of furniture on it, and I would ride the bike out to set it up. When someone, a dealer in Connecticut, saw that, literally it went from 0 to 120 miles an hour. Overnight, it went crazy. Um, I didn't have the employees, I didn't have the size studio, I didn't have the tools, etc., etc. So those next 4 years, that was 1986 to 1990, were just growing and growing. And you want to buy more machines, you want to buy more hand tools, you need more benches. So it was like almost a hand to mouth type thing. By the time 1980 hit, everything was just boom, off and running. I had a number of employees, I had them trained to where I needed them to be. Um, what really took off was that, as we spoke before, was that Colonial Homes article. When that came out that was August of '97. The edition, I think that may have come out probably the beginning of summer of '97. Um, that year I had 100,000 phone calls. I almost went out of business from the amount of calls. All that I did all day was answer the phone. And everyone, to my surprise, will you send me your photographs? Will you send me your catalog? And we're such a small entity, we were not set up for that. So within the first 4 weeks, we were set for the next 2 years. We had enough work to go. And I didn't know what to tell people. Say, you know what, I'll put you on a list, I'll call you back if something opens up. We'll be able to do another tall case clock, another dining table, more chairs, another carved bed, whatever the case may be. But it was like instant explosion overnight success with Colonial Homes. So at the end of the day, probably 110,000 phone calls in a year and a half after that hit the newsstand. And just a kind of a crazy thing. I was doing some work in New York City on 57th Street, and I went down in an apartment, and I went down to get some lunch. Walked down to the end of the street, and there's a huge newsstand on the corner on 57th Street at the time, anyway. And they, when new magazines would come out, they put them on a separate stand. Maybe 10, 12 different magazines came out this week, and they had them there. And here I looked over, and there's Colonial Homes, August '97, and I was in it. So how crazy was that? So my first view of the magazine, and as I looked uptown, I could see the top of the Hearst building where a year and a half ago I made my pitch to try and be a part of the Colonial Homes ambiance. So it worked. So
That must have been an incredible
So how
feeling.
interesting was that? Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
So going from 0 to 120 miles an hour, as you said, what was the volume of production at the high point of your furniture making, and discuss like the number of pieces that went out the door?
Well, I always tell people that from 1990 to 2000, I never left that studio. 7 days a week, 14, 16, 18 hours a day sometimes. And you have to understand, this is a position I really didn't want to be in, was to have craftsmen under me. I wanted to be the sole craftsman. When I worked in this little studio, shack, whatever you called it back in the day, from the beginning and we'll get into that later, but so anyway, so 7 days a week I worked. The problem is that when you have employees, there's always mistakes, no matter how good the employees are. The final judge of my mistakes are my clients, and I take the reckoning for that. So at the end of the day, 5, 6 o'clock, everyone's left. I go and examine the piece in question, the work they've done. If, in fact, I think it's going to take too much time for a mistake or some way they were going astray tomorrow, I would sit and do the retrofit or do the, redo or undo the mistake that they were making. I go around all the benches of my employees. This would take me anywhere from 4 to 5 hours sometimes. Sometimes I would have nothing to do and everything was perfectly fine. But instead of them having to come back and to complain to them to start over, so I would take care of this at night. So this was a job that went on to 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night. Then I would do invoices and quotes and hopefully somewhere in between, return some phone calls and give people excuses why I can't get back to them because I'm just so busy. And so many people couldn't understand that. But what it created was it created a whole series of collectors of our furniture. So somebody buys a break front now. Next year they want a dining table. Next year they want the chairs. They want the low boy, the high boy, the bed, the guest room. And this went on and on and on. And so it went on until probably around 2000, halfway through 2000. And then it's like a train. I always liken this to a 100-car train. There's so much power and momentum, or a ship that's going down the Delaware River that's full of coal that you can't stop it. It takes miles to stop it at even 6 miles an hour. I never thought we would stop. We had such momentum and such a grand backlog, but things changed. The economy changed going to 2000, 2001. Society changed. Another generation had come to pass. The people I was working for began to die, and now their kids were inheriting their furniture collections. And soon after that, there was no more of the high-style country tiger maple for me nor my competitors. My competitors seemingly dropped out quicker than I did because some of my competitors were not actually the, quote, craftsman owner, as I was. So I could continue to make and to build and design when they were only great designers and great knowledgeable people about furniture, but yet they weren't physically doing the benchmade work themselves. So then their businesses ceased. I went on for another couple of years. So very interesting how these things have come to pass.
Absolutely. And you mentioned previously that you were not per se a retailer. However, did you also got calls directly from customers as well as selling your line through retailers?
Yes.
Can you
And I must add in the beginning that the one thing I was never cared for as, again, I never planned to have a business myself. This is something that kind of fell into place, but I never believed in quote advertising. I mean, putting your ad in a newspaper or in a magazine that costs $3,000-4,000 a month for a quarter-page ad or something. You have to do that so repetitively back in the day that people notice you and start to write you. You could go bankrupt in the offing. Today it's so different with Instagram and various means of cyber type advertising. It's so different. But back then I didn't believe into it, and crazily enough, I think as luck be it, the grace of God, one person looks at that van that I drive my bike out to see, and then they knew a network of people that were in similar situations, mom and pop, who understand what quality traditional benchmade craftsmanship was, and they wanted to sell it out of their historic little structures in those cities we talked about. And alas, overnight I was set up with a network, and boom, you just call each one up when you're doing a cutting, and you just write down the number of pieces, and that's how it would happen. So,
and as you said, it's a different mindset now, unfortunately. But
very, very much so. But back to that, I mean, this was a 7-day-a-week affair for me. I never took a day off from 1990 to 2000, and it was just pounding and pounding and pounding of hand planing and using molding planes, designing, finishing, shellac finish applications. So it didn't end. So in retrospect now, when I look back and I thought, my God, if the economy didn't change, if societal wants and desires didn't change, I'd be dead by now, because I was working so much, getting no sleep, not reaping the benefits of the fruits of my labor. And so I needed a change. So maybe something changed it for me. So going into 1990, the marketplace changed drastically, and I had to decide whether I was going to stay in this field or not. I'd eventually lay off my employees, my craftsmen, and then that's when I decided to go to restoration in 2000 and choose to go to the most infamous place in the world, the Eco Boule in Paris, to learn restoration and conservation of the furniture that I've been building and copying for years. So possibly it's looked at as going a little bit backward. I started building copies, and now I'm choosing to go into a field that saves the originals that I've chosen to copy for all these years. A lot of people get into my field by doing the restoration and saying, well, I think I'm going to build one of those pieces on my own and see how I can fare. I did it in the reverse, and it worked out very well.
And just to back up a little bit, can you just discuss, was your product typically bench-made or partially machine-made? And what are your thoughts on the benefits of a bench-made piece of furniture versus mass-produced?
Well, it was in a very strange time, because going in from the early to mid 80s to the 90s, quote, traditional furniture meaning copies of 17th, 18th, and 19th century furniture, were very hot. I mean, I was asked by the state of Virginia to come up with a line of furniture for the Richmond Museum, the Virginia National Museum, including pieces of Robert E. Lee. So all kind of opportunities arose. I've been asked by the Smithsonian to create a series of 6 clocks that they could sell in their gift shops, online, and things like this. So a lot of crazy opportunities have arrived, part and parcel over the years.
And so that being said, you somewhat answer my next question. Was your business mainly local, or was it regional to the East Coast, or was it nationwide?
Well, the business was primarily national in the beginning. Again, Denver, Dallas, Houston, San Francisco. And then it settled into between in New England, south of Boston, not so much Boston, because I had a couple competitors up in Boston, and they did phenomenal work. They did absolutely phenomenal work. And so they were kind of doing the Boston look. I was doing the Philadelphia style of furniture. So I settled into my own mid-Atlantic, but I had a couple of my own competitors in the immediate, say, 60-mile radius. And that gets a bit fierce too, and it depends. Again, how do you market? Do you market vis-a-vis you're doing wholesale to dealers? I mean, to make a bench-made product is wholesale, but we just didn't touch on what is bench-made, so let's go back to that. But it was a very strange time in the mid-'80s. In the mid-'80s, we had some of the big furniture manufacturers from North Carolina, and everyone has to understand, North Carolina was the furniture making capital of the world, whether you liked it, appreciated it, hated it. They had anything from contemporary to hardcore traditional, say Williamsburg style. People like Baker making Williamsburg, and they did a very good job. The finishes were not on par. The finishes were lacquer instead of shellac, way too glossy. But the designs were, they were licensed designs, so they were very true. The object structure was true, but the finishes were poor, to say the least. And it was machine carved, not hand carved. But nevertheless, you're competing with a very high-end machine traditional industry. I had a competitor only made 100% bench-made stuff. All they would do was use hand planes. They'd take a rough board and they'd hand plane it down. They'd glue it together and they'd make a panel, and et cetera, et cetera. So to compete competitively on the wholesale market, we couldn't do that. We had clients that wanted just total bench-made products. So everything made by hand tools, hand files, hand planes, on the bench, that's bench-made. To one craftsman making the entire object or piece of furniture on this bench. We chose probably 30% machine-made and 70% bench-made. And that was the ability to do a, quote, wholesale product, which is very, very difficult. You gotta have your numbers straight. You got to be very accurate. Your employees have to be good. They have to work fast, and you've got to be multiples. So we would do multiples. So multiples for us, as we'll take a quick stroll around the studio later on, was when we did tall case clocks. We do one run a year of tall case clocks, and it was a Chester County style. We would do from 12 to 16 clocks. So that was a run. So if I was doing the mid door, carving a shell on the mid door, I'd have 12 laid out on my bench. And I gang carve them. I carve one lobe, carve the next lobe. Each of 12 drawers go back, start the second lobe, go down and down and down, using the carving tools you see behind me. And that's called gang carving. And that's how we could participate in a, quote, semi-wholesale market, using maybe 20-30% machine tools, all the rest hand done. Our finishes were hand done. We had a competitor that may have done a little more handwork than us, but they used a commercial lacquer finish. And it looked like a lacquer finish. It doesn't have the feel, the smell, the texture of shellac, which is important for an 18th century, 19th century finish. So they're kind of the pros and cons and who was doing what with Benchmade. But it was an interesting era because we had some doing this and some doing that. So, and as far as selling the product, there was shows. There was shows at coliseums and things like that, regional shows. You may have to travel to North Carolina to Boston for a show, but we didn't have to do that. Once our dealer network was set up, it just took off, and a lot of my competitors continued. Actually, 4 out of the 5 continue to do shows like that with a dog and pony. It's a lot of damage, a lot of cost, a lot of setup, takedown. It's a whole new, different segment of the business that you have to support while doing it, besides worrying about the authentication and dealing with customers of, to build an authentic product.
Absolutely, and it sounds exhausting as well. So I know you said around 2000 the business tailed off, but are there craftsmen doing this type of work in the U.S. now, the Benchmade?
Well, I think as human beings, when you're in the moment, back in the '90s, back in the '80s, I knew who the major players were, and they knew my competitors knew who the players were, and we each found our own niche, and sometimes we think, well, 20 years has gone by, there's nobody out there, but let's come back into reality. We're very disposable as human beings. It doesn't matter relationships or craftsmanship. There's always somebody coming up with the same desires that I had 20, 30, 40 years ago, whatever the case may be, to take our place. And we may think there's not, but it's different today, and I'm not quite aware that there's individuals out there that have businesses like we had and my competitors had during the 80s and 90s. Very different time because there's not the demand for this kind of furniture back then. Today, you find a lot of people, if you pick up some of the more popular woodworking magazines, maybe some art magazines that deal with furniture, you can see some very world-class hands, Americans, guys that probably don't do this totally full-time. I find it hard to believe that they can, producing great stuff, great traditional furniture, great contemporary furniture. Yes, it continues, and I'm so happy the art continues, but yet it's not the same way it was producing a line of furniture back in the 80s and 90s. There's just not the demand for it. But I think there's a lot of people that do this part-time, or they moonlight doing it, or there's some kind of crazy combination. And today we're in some kind of crazy mode in the entire world that we have to have the biggest, the best, the longest, the heaviest, the most expensive of everything, the most detailed. So what I find is the people that are doing this, not periodically, but when I run across shows and I stop into some of the places that actually teach, quote, woodworking or classes today, that they take this 18th century style craftsmanship that we painstakingly tried to emulate to make it look like it wasn't new back in the 80s and 90s, almost to another level. It's like restoring the 68 Camaro Z28 to a degree that, it's better than it was original. I mean, if you had a 68 Camaro and you had, in the wheel wells, you may have drips of the paint. Today, they don't have drips of the paint, a lot of them. They're doing it, everything's pristine, underneath, on top, below, around, the whole thing. So it's a problem that if you don't love the past, and I find too many younger people today don't migrate and love the past like 20, 30 years ago, then they don't know how to emulate as furniture makers and artists and designers and craftsmen, even if they're part-time, how to emulate these pieces from our past, because they don't understand it and they're not willing to study it. So, but that doesn't take away that they're not good craftsmen or artists. So.
I think you touched on current training programs. Can you give us a little more information on what furniture training programs are available in the U.S.?
There's not a lot to go down this road. There are a few. There's one in Maine, a very good center that can teach you anywhere from the best traditional veneering techniques to sculpting to finishing, etc. And they turned into bona fide schools. They were kind of backwoodsy, chicken coop type affairs back in the early 90s, and this is not degraded them. That's how they started out. But they've blossomed in the last 20 years to being some of the best places in this country that you can find traditional furniture techniques. Is there a place out there? There may be a couple shows showing you how to do full-blown furniture from start to finish. North Bennett Street School is one of them. They also do historic preservation programs, primarily geared to younger people, but they also take you through the top of the line furniture. And there's just a gifted individual up in Massachusetts, also Phil Lowe. He's a friend, and Phil has a program. He has a furniture school there, and you can go from A to Z. And Phil's, I don't know if he has year programs, 2-year programs. Nevertheless, you'll learn to build the finest period furniture available today and techniques used by Mr. Lowe. So there are training programs available, but there's just not a lot. So those two are probably the premier in the country. And then you have small schools that have individual craftspeople like myself and say, oh, I'll be showing up in North Carolina next month, and Georgia and Utah 3 months from now. That's the kind of affairs. It's a 2-day program, a week program, but they're very short stint courses. Whereas if you go to Europe, you can still go to France, you go to Italy, and you go to England, and get yourself into full-blown apprenticeship programs. But the programs you're going to get there are going to be the real deal. It's going to be dealing with, say, marquetry, bull style marquetry, French polishing, gilding, full 2, 3, 4-year programs, which are not available here. Here it's an overview, and you go through, and maybe you'll make 2 pieces of furniture in your tenure there. So, and that's pretty much what exists. But I'm so happy to see that these programs still push forth, and there is still a desire of traditional furniture being built out there. And I must say that I'm very, very unhappy after doing this for 30 years to see that there's major universities in this country promoting very well-known named universities that promote, quote, art, woodworking, and art things, whether it becomes glassmaking or woodworking. Primarily here we're talking about woodworking. And they really dupe the students, in my opinion, that if, particularly in bowl making and turning, if you do this, you're going to go be an artist and a hero, and you make a lot of money and you be famous. That's so far from the truth. And unfortunately, they're taking young people's tuition and money, and they're giving them 4 years of training. They're making wonderful craftsmen with the professors or the teachers they have in-house, but they put them out there, and where are they to work? There's no jobs. So you've got to be a self-made individual to take the art and dexterity and combine it with business and branding today, and to go out and be successful. And that's what these universities are not doing. They're taking money from the people, showing them how to be a craftsman with a college degree behind them, but they're not following through. So it's not a good thing. It's very discouraging. Yeah.
Well, we'd like to take the last few minutes of our interview to find out. So once the furniture business tailed off in the 2000s, what path did you take from there? What additional training? What happened?
I had to do some soul searching while we kept the business going in the late 90s, which were still very busy, into 2000. As I saw some things dwindling, some market changes, I knew I wanted to stay in an ancillary field. So, I've been a collector of antique furniture for 30 years, and I have such pride to carry out the ability, or I wanted the ability, to take furniture that was being deteriorated and carry on my forebears what they had produced 200, 300, 400 years ago. So one of my objectives, it was a 2-phase thing. I wanted to be astute in the furniture and restoration field. So I started asking around before business totally started turning with a new societal generation coming in. Where do you go? Repeatedly, it would come back and say, if you want to learn to become a master craftsman, go to the École Boulle in Paris, France. École Boulle is a 250-year-old school. French furniture goes back over 300 years. And at a point, the French said, we need a place to train and teach conservation and restoration of the furniture that was made 100 years ago. Now, this is 250 years ago. So the French were so far ahead of their time. So they created the École Boulle, named after the superb craftsman to the king, André Charles Boulle, which he lived at the Louvre Museum for many years, being the French king's cabinet or furniture maker. So that was an option. The second option was doing a stint at Westdean College, which is in southern England, which is the premier conservation restoration university in the world. There's nothing like that, absolutely nothing like that in the States. There's more of the quote white collar thing at Winterthur. University of Delaware works with Winterthur, but that's prepping people to work in the museums. And the issue with that is that you have to come in there. They're hopeful you come in there with dexterous skills, particularly to say in the cabinet making, furniture making segment. How can you go into the program for this kind of advanced degree without understanding how furniture is made? So in years past, there's a dearth of individuals that go into that program, but that's not there to train and treat you how to be a master craftsman or artisan. That's only available at the École Bulle in Paris. So not only are you learning conservation and restoration, but you're learning the art of how to make that furniture, whichever genre you choose. In Wesleyan College, I mean, they actually have a furniture conservation program, a master's degree, and that's why I attended many classes. I got certification in leather conservation, but in addition, they have a wonderful, the only one in the world, historic preservation program in clock making at Wesleyan. So I was at the crossroads. It was two-phase. I would have learned conservation and restoration, so I chose to go to the École Bulle in Paris. I was there for 2 years and got certified, the only American to go through the entire restoration conservation program. And the other thing I needed to do, which I felt I had a love of clocks. So of all the things, all the forms, the objects that I produced in the 1990s, the tall case clock was by far, it was a piece of furniture with a brain. It had a head, it had a midsection, it had a base. So almost a body with intelligence inside. And that's how I saw it. So I wanted to learn how to restore not only the cases vis-a-vis, say, the École Bulle properly, but also the brain. So I spent a lot of certificate programs in England, in the British Horological Institute, and 2 stints out at the National Watch and Clock Museum, and later I did a fellowship in 2009, 2010 out there. So that completed my program. So I started there at the beginning of the 2000s and completing at the end of the 2000s, first decade. So, and a lot of training in between. I went back for about 8 years. I may go back 1 or 2 months a year and do apprenticeships under some of the finest artisans in the world in Paris. And whether it's in gilding, marquetry, sculpting. So I continued to do that until I kind of exhausted myself of traveling and funds and really needed to get back into the studio and practice some of these lost time procedures that before I forget them. And now, I seek to pass this on to people, but there's just not that burning desire out there. And there's a real drawback, but of human nature, of course. You always have people that are seeking you out, and I do this, people that want to learn, but they want to come and they want to suck information out of me and then go do their own thing. I want people to be honest when they look you in the eye and say, they want to stay a certain time in your studio and be an apprentice and learn the information and has a vis-a-vis give back to me and them to do some work in the studio also, not just a hit and run scenario and go. So that's quite the drawback of today's society. Everybody wants to be the master overnight. They want to be able to produce a little record on a CD, which, as you remember, back in the 60s and the 70s, to get a record deal with the company took a long time. You had to be good. You had to be at the top of the ranks in the 70s and 60s. And today you can go and make a CD in your studio or in your bedroom. It doesn't matter. It's the same thing. Everybody wants to be like the lip syncing of somebody that did a record a number of years ago. Want overnight success, and the same the woodworkers that come to me asking me for help and advice. Can you show me that technique? I mean, I want true, honest people that want to propagate this craft into the future, not for their financial and ego gain as it's so prevalent in our society today.
Well, we greatly appreciate your time, and we're going to take a quick break, but then we want to rejoin you for a walkthrough of your conservation studio here, if we may.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks for coming by.
Thank you. We're back with Gregg Perry at the Shivers Conservation Studio, and Gregg's going to give us a quick walkthrough. Go ahead, Gregg.
Hi, back again here. This is a typical type mirror that we would have produced, a looking glass, a copy of. They came in 20 different sizes in the day, 20 different, sizes, styles, things like that. You can see the beautiful tiger maple wood, and obviously this has no glass in it right now. So this is just kind of a remnant, a leftover from that time period. But again, this is the original studio I started in the early 80s, and it's not very big, but it's homey and it feels good. So we have a tall case clock in, just an example of what's in the studio today for restoration. This was a copy of the Colonial Homes magazine from August of '97, so that was quite the boost in our business, and so that was our 5-second claim to fame, so to speak. But so as we span around the studio here, thing of interest over here, this is a publication I did for the Watch and Clock Museum in their magazine. I did bronze mount casting in France when I was there, and I did a whole dissertation about casting, so in the lost wax process or the sand cast process. So that can be found. And up here on the back wall behind my main bench, you're going to see all the active molding planes that I use for for reproducing moldings and building furniture or making that lost piece of widget for restoration. Just a myriad of colors and for alcohol-based, water-based, shellacs. These are all various resins that get mixed in for hardening up shellac finishes, giving certain sheens, mimicking what was there done when I'm doing physical film finish analysis and things of that nature. Here's just a part of 8 trays of my carving tools behind my bench, and we'll take a walk over here. And as you see up here, hanging from the ceiling, chairs that I've done back into the late '90s. We have a William Savory copy in walnut. We have a child's chair in tiger maple, ball and claw feet, pierced backsplat, and all the way over at the end. This is a reproduction chair. This is a chair that I've done copy. I did one for a client. I did 2. Some very interesting neat carving on that, but that chair is in walnut. So, and behind here is this is number 376 tall case clock that I've done in my run as a furniture maker, and it still hangs around. I don't know. This has, if you can see, I'm sure you can see, it's absolutely the most phenomenal grain for a tall case clock. But yet this guy's been hanging around. I believe the last clock that I made is 2000. So 375 clocks since the year 2000. We just have some hanging, components of furniture over there. Another tall case clock, a pie crust tabletop, a mirror that I've carved on the top. And here's actually the sign that I had in front of my building at one time in Pennsylvania, Gregg Perry Furniture Makers. So come on in here. This is an addition to the studio. Sitting here on historic Alloway Lake, where glass making first started in Worcesterburg in Salem County, New Jersey. And a few things that were just completed. I just did a total restoration conservation for a local historical society of this William Savory walnut chair. And it's just a very basic tripod chair for a client. So, but the thing I want everyone to know is, there's nothing like solitude, is to look out the back of your studio and to see water and to see wildlife, and that's how I chose it to be here. So returning home. So the really interesting thing it all started here in historic Alloway, New Jersey. Go all the way around the world. I've studied it extensively at the British Horological Institute in the West Midlands in England, Westdean College in Southampton, and then the infamous École in Paris, France, with a number, over 20 apprenticeships in the next following 10 years. So to go all the way around the world and come back and to be replanted here in historic Alloway, New Jersey. So, Gregg Perry, thanks for asking me to come into my studio.
Thank you.